Thank you for having me at the Cambridge Journal of Economics 2021 conference. The title of my presentation is Cultures of Inequality, Financialization, Labor and Social Finance. And I wish to thank the Australian Research Council for support given to this work. First of all, I would like to introduce and summarize the core of my argument, which I will develop in the next few slides. I will start by saying that in the last quarter of a century, we've seen a number of important institutional changes in the broad area of finance, including phenomena that we broadly define under the umbrella of financialization. So sometimes social finance is conceived in the context of financialization, as I will do, sometimes in the sense that social finance represents a set of new tools, new ways to bring together private capital, sometimes in combination with government funding to address specified social needs in exchange for unexpected positive financial returns. So I want to frame the development and the growth of social finance in the context of financialization, but I will try to argue that social finance is more than the allocation of financial resources. It's more than product innovation. It's more than innovation in the context of intermediation in financial markets. It's social finance is a set of discourses about the veracity of the market and the legitimacy of finance in the context of important societal challenges that developed since the late 70s and early 80s. So what I want to do is to trace the recent historical and institutional developments of social finance by going back to the late 70s and early 80s, and speak a little bit briefly about the economic and legal transformations that have characterized many advanced economies such as the US, UK, including Australia and European economies. So I will argue that social finance is embedded in a process that, first of all, involves the laboring finance, the preparation of a field where financial forces become dominant to shape the economic and social outcomes. The second important moment in this analysis of historical institutional developments that ground the development of social finance is the global financial crisis, and particularly what happened immediately after the global financial crisis with the crisis of belief, a crisis of belief that capitalism can deliver socially acceptable and desirable outcomes. And that's where social finance plays a role, an important cultural role in a process that I call financing labor. So rather than conceiving social finance in the context of a balancing between demand and supply, demand represented by social needs and supply through these funds, private capital in combination with sometimes public funding, public capital, I will argue that social finance makes it explicit that the inequality of power between finance and labor, inequality of power that is very clear in an hegemonic sense, a discourse and set of practices that combine coercion and consent. So let me start first of all by briefly summarizing a huge literature on financialization. As we know, financialization has been conceived, broadly speaking, as the increasing role of financial motives, financial market, financial actors, and institutions in the operation of the domestic and international economies. It has involved the changes in the pattern of accumulation. It has involved a system of income redistribution based on rent as opposed to participation in production. It has also been grounded by important financial deregulation phenomena and changes in the legal framework where these changes, economic changes, were taking place. It has involved, importantly, new models of corporate governance and, of course, new financial instruments, new tools, new ways of doing finance. In that context, sometimes social finance is framed as one of these financial innovations, new financial tool, new financial ways to perform operations of intermediation. So I will argue that social finance is more than product innovation. Okay, that's an important point. And how I frame social finance is the circular moment, the circular movement between finance and labor, what I will call the labor in finance in the first phase, and then the financing labor. And finance, social finance, and make it explicit, these circular movements between finance and labor that performs a shortening of the distance between finance and labor, but also allows to make it explicit the way the finance and labor change the other. So labor changes finance and finance changes labor, and the discourses surrounding finance and labor. So the first phase is talking about labor in finance. What I mean here is that indeed, I believe that social finance indeed represents a convergence of contemporary financial, neoliberal, and market processes that together regulate poverty and social reproduction under capitalism, as it has been pointed out before. But this statement, I will try to give this statement further analysis. So the first objective of this article is really to provide an overview of the social context, the social and economic context, where the social needs that the social finance addresses, so these social programs, they seek to address issues based on education, housing, healthcare. So how these social needs have emerged since the 1970s. So the 1970s and the early 80s see the beginning of a rising income and wealth inequality. So these trends have been observed in a few, not one, advanced economies. And so Britain and the United States are clearly falling into this category of economies that saw a really rising income and wealth inequality. So what we know is that the rising inequality is certainly driven by the notorious 1%. And we trace it back to the rising of incentives, fringe benefits, CEO pay rising because of these elements of their pay compared to the average wages. So we can see in this diagram the skyrocketing trend of CEO payments versus the average wages in the US. Now, from the late 70s, early 80s, what is also clear is that we are witnessing the end of the social wage. The end of a social wage means the end of a wage that is basically able to cover for the basic needs of the living. Here we see how the first decile of the wage distribution, this is the US wage distribution, fell substantially starting from the 70s and continued over the next couple of decades. So this end of the social wage, together with the rising salaries for CEOs, the rampant wage and the wealth inequality, really indicates that labor markets are central to understand the evolution of the economic, the ability of the growing groups of workers to fund their basic needs, housing, education, retraining, healthcare, and so on and so forth. So the centrality of the labor markets. The other point that the other major change that happens in the late 70s and early 80s that supports the laboring of finance is the change of the legal framework where finance is embedded. So there are two particular moments that are very important. The Employee Retirement and Income Security Act of 1974, which basically allowed insurance companies, pension funds and insurance companies to invest in risky securities, in the so-called junk bonds and venture funds, rather than just only corporate and government securities. The second important point is the Saint Germain Act of 1982 in the US, which basically allowed saving and loans institutions, S&L, to hold the junk bonds. So these S&L funds usually were very low risk and low return funds targeted to household and workers to protect them from the risk embedded in the financial investment, in participation in the stock market. What these two major changes have done, so the labor market changes together with the changes in the legal framework, is to support the cultural changes, what I call the opening the doors to cultures of inequality. The changes in the culture of inequality means a broad and growing acceptance of inequality as a natural product of a market participation, of market economies. This is really important for neoliberal modes of government, because neoliberal modes of government, Brown in 2015 is telling us, rely more and more on competition rather than exchange. So competition becomes the central principle for governing the living. And this is important to understand further changes in the culture, as I will outline in a few moments. But let's go back for a moment to what it means, what the end of the social wage means. The end of the social wage means that these wages, particularly for the so-called the unskilled, became so low and too low relative to those social insurance benefits that Western government were still providing in the 70s, such as Medicaid, food stamps, public housing, and all the other goods and services of the welfare state. So the wage, particularly for the unskilled, falls below these benefits publicly provided. So there is a real bite in the late 70s and early 80s, which is clearly illustrated by what I call behavioral capitalism and discourses around the behavioral capitalism. What is behavioral capitalism? Well, if we read again George Gilder, who was the utopian thinker of technology who inspired the Reaganomics of the late 1980s, we have an idea of what behavioral capitalism. It's a logic of free and unrestrained markets, because only free and unrestrained markets can lead to the moral and economic rejuvenation of late 20th century capitalism. And behavioral capitalism understands individuals as respondents, as agents that respond to incentives, beliefs, and constraints. This is really important because behavioral capitalism understands the agent's freedom in participating in market action, in market operation, as pivotal for the success of neoliberal modes of governments. So the neoliberal focus is really on freedom. The challenge is how to manage neoliberal governance modes without touching this freedom, but soliciting the freedom and the response grounded on freedom by the Homo economicus. So what is important here is that there is the need to engender an appetite for risk. So risk becomes not only embedded in markets, but what is important for the together with accepting inequality is an acceptance of the risk of failure, an acceptance of the possibility of a loss that the agents endowed with human capital accepts as he or she participates in the market. So what we observe is a shift of risk from capital to labor Atkinson 2015 and make it clear that there is around in the 1980s, we have witnessed a dramatic decline in social insurance in all major OECD countries. That's what I mean, a shift of risk from capital to labor. So we reached the moment of financing labor. Why financing labor? Well, first of all, we need to talk briefly about the saving glut. What is the saving glut? Is the soaring of corporate profits, which led to a global oversupply of financial resources that needed to be allocated somewhere. And this supply of loanable funds in excess of the demand for loanable funds had the potential to destabilize financial markets and to undermine the foundation of major capitalist economies in the world. So what we see at the very onset of the global financial crisis is the need to allocate these financial resources in excess of what the market wanted. Then the global financial crisis came. And what the global financial crisis has meant is that there is a huge erosion of confidence and by the agents, by individual agents in participating in financial markets. So I use this diagram from the Trust in Financial Markets. It's a financial trust index to show you how trust in financial markets was really oscillating wildly immediately after the global financial crisis for a number of years. Why do I need these two important moments, the global change, the important changes in the labor markets, the important changes in the legal framework, and the changes in trust in capitalism that was triggered by the global financial crisis? Because recovering from the crisis, the global financial crisis of trust was, which meant a crisis of trust, was necessary to save capitalism. Now, embedded in the discussion following the global financial crisis was the call for financial literacy education. Now, this is an important point because there are two paradoxical questions raised in this context. How can financially literate agents trust themselves? And how to rebuild the trust in the system in the face of these financially literate agents? And that's where social finance really plays an important role. So in order to understand this point, I go back to Luhmann, 1979, who says, what are the ways to building up trust in the system? Building up in a way that doesn't depend on the personal elements. You actually shift forward the threshold of effective distrust. So rebuilding trust in the system involves the pushing forward the zone of indistinction between trust and mistrust, an oscillation between trust and mistrust. It is this zone of indistinction between trust and mistrust that social finance plays a role. How? Well, first of all, through priming. Social finance operates in this context of indistinction between trust and untrust. So fixing market failures is not addressed through regulation, but rather through market innovation, social finance. And this is important because social finance addresses concerns of trust with respect to capitalism by offering a system where trust in decentralized, bottom-up and transparent approaches is gaining momentum. So with social finance and financial institutions are shown to be fundamental to the long-run growth and sustainability of the real economy and society. So social finance is a priming device. First of all, we have to understand what priming is. Priming is different from incentives. It refers to the activation of mental concept through subtle situational clues. So money priming is important. The mere idea of money can change responses and behavior. Money priming can alter responses related to system justification, social dominance, belief in a just world, and through a free market ideology. So what we see social finance is at the very center of the circular movement between finance and labor. But rather than operating a balance between finance and labor, social finance establishes a real inequality of power between labor and finance, establishes a sort of hegemonic power of finance over labor. So hegemonic means a mixture of consent and coercion. So I remind you all that one of the most important tasks of social finance is intermediation, building consensus among stakeholders and engaging investors and liaising with service providers to reach the desired outcomes. So an hegemony producing social finance stems from the coercion of an endogenously created demand for social impact with the changes in labor markets, the change in the legal framework, and the ability of social finance to organize consensus about finance's ability to respond to its call to be a servant to the living. So at the moment, social finance shows that the poor, rather than marginally important to finance, has become actually central to global capital. What I mean by the poor is the poor's needs, housing, education, health care, and so on. So what social finance has successfully done is to shift the threshold of trust in the system by removing the call to address the root causes of social problems. I conclude by arguing that whether social finance can contribute to reshaping finance as a servant to the living in ways that our socially relevant goals are not subordinated to the power of finance is indeed in doubt.